So, James Gerrard is the Professor of Archaeology at Newcastle University. His research areas are late Roman and early medieval material culture of the British Isles and Northern Europe, with special interest in numismatics, you would use a word that's always hard to say, ceramics and metal objects. And he's talking to us about the Halkyn mountain hoard and Western cauldrons in Britain. So I'm going to hand over to him. Over to you.
Right, thank you for that introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm caught between teaching late yesterday and a university open day tomorrow, so I asked to be put on early-ish in the programme, and I didn't expect to be opening, so that's a great honour. It's particularly an honour for me, because as a late Romanist, I always expect to be at the end of the session, right? And I am talking to you today about a local find. Some of you may have heard me speak about this before, the Halkyn mountain hoard. I would like to start, though, just dedicating this talk to the memory of the late and great Professor Di Morgan Evans. It's almost 10 years now since Di passed away. And thank you, Howard. Howard is in the audience. Thank you. I've stolen this image from your blog. It will become obvious why I am dedicating this paper to Di as it progresses. We ought to remember Di, chair of the Society of Antiquaries of London, visiting professor here, and a great archaeologist, always kind to me. You will undoubtedly know something about Roman copper alloy vessel hoards. This is a distribution map. Whenever I put this up, people say, oh, there are more than dots on that map than here. I'm sure there are. This is an amalgamation of a particular series of sources. Copper alloy vessel hoards are underappreciated and unloved. They are not treasure in the old-fashioned sense of the word. And they haven't always been treated kindly. And I've kind of been sucked into tackling some of these hoards. Halkyn Mountain is the blue dot here. And if we look at the distribution of, these are late Roman copper alloy hoards in Britain. If we look at the find dates of those hoards, you'll see that the majority of these are antiquarian finds. So they were found in the 19th century by people building railway lines, draining agricultural land. Once upon a time, I could have gone through all of these sites and named them. I'm not sure I can still remember all of the names. But the one with the big blue circle around is Halkyn Mountain. And it is the earliest recorded Roman copper alloy vessel hoard from Britain, to the best of my knowledge, found about the year 1760. It is a phenomenally early antiquarian discovery. And it was published by this man, Sir Joseph Banks. Now, Banks is better remembered as a naturalist and a geographer, but was also an antiquarian. He wasn't just an antiquarian, a naturalist, and a geographer. He was the man in science, confidant of George III, related to one of the prime ministers of the United Kingdom, a very powerful patron of the arts and sciences, a very big cheese. On his death, his papers, the British Museum refused to buy his papers, I believe, and they were dispersed across the globe. So some of his correspondence is now in Canada and Australia in places. So it's quite difficult to get back to Sir Joseph Banks' archive. But he publishes these objects in Archaeologia, having displayed them to the Society of Antiquaries. And this is the plate that sometimes gets reproduced. And the vessel at the top left is a Westland cauldron. So on the left here, you have the text from Archaeologia, and on the right, you have a photograph of the Society of Antiquaries minute book. Those texts are not quite exactly the same. So the minute book is the original record, and you can see, hopefully that, yeah. So the Right Honourable Sir Joseph Banks, Baronet, Knight of the Bath, etc., exhibited at the Society some curious fragments of culinary vessels supposed to be of Roman workmanship. And that is followed more or less word for word by the Archaeologia publication. It goes on, says, these vessels were found upwards of 40 years ago, several yards below the earth and sinking a mine shaft at Long Rake in the eastern part of Halkyn Mountain. And there is a footnote, which doesn't appear in the minute book, but the footnote says, there were two other cauldrons, it's the same form as figure 1, which I've just shown you, and gives the dimensions, 11.5 and 14.5 inches, and two other Urchester-type bowls. That's important for this story. Halkyn Mountain you probably know better than I do. If you look at the 19th century mapping of Halkyn Mountain, it is riddled with evidence of earlier mining, so lead mines, mine shafts. I don't think, unless we find something in Banks's papers, I don't think we will be able to locate the find spot any more precisely than in the Archaeologia article. And there, it is one of a number of hoards from North Wales. So again, many of these antiquarian finds, probably all except Halkyn Mountain are earlier Roman, I would say, with these handled pans. They're not as late as Halkyn Mountain. And you have 3 Westland cauldrons like this. Notice the, I suppose, pear-shaped holes through the triangular lugs or ears. So these are vessels that have been used. That's also important for our story. We have a carinated bowl, a sort of flat dish, and some Urchester bowls. So we have 3 Urchester-type bowls and 3 Westland cauldrons, of which this is the only one that is illustrated. So just to kind of summarise that, we have these vessels illustrated in Archaeologia, and we have a footnote that tells us that the Hoard had additional vessels, including 2 other cauldrons, 2 other Urchester-type bowls. Now, I wish I could remember which conference this was, but in a venue very much like this, at a conference very much like this, standing in a queue for coffee that seemed to go on forever. Quite a long time ago, I was talking to Di about the Halkyn Mountain Hoard and how interesting it was. And he said to me, well, of course, we've got 2 in the collections of the Society of Antiquaries. And I've always thought that they were probably from Halkyn Mountain, but I've never been able to prove it. And there are indeed, in the collections of the Society of Antiquaries of London, 2 Westland cauldrons. We know nothing about how they came into the collections, but they were in the possession of the Society of Antiquaries by 1847, and the person who catalogued them compared them correctly to a cauldron that had been found in 1817 in a so-called warrior grave at Sawston in Cambridgeshire. So, where would the Society of Antiquaries get not 1, but 2 Westland cauldrons before 1847? Right? Westland cauldrons are not common in Britain. And it did strike me that the footnote suggests that some of those vessels, that those vessels were displayed to the Society of Antiquaries or came to the Society of Antiquaries in 2 batches. We have the dimensions, and if you go to the Society of Antiquaries and you measure these cauldrons, they measure about 370 mil, 290 mil. So the bigger of these is about 14.57 inches in diameter. Depends where you measure them. They're not exactly circular anymore. And the smaller is about 11.42 inches. And The vessels discussed in Archaeologia were 14.5 inches in diameter and 11.5 inches in diameter. So I suggest to you that in the absence of absolute documentary proof about the provenance of these objects, the most logical explanation is that these are the two additional cauldrons from the Halkyn mountain hoard. These are the only surviving objects from that antiquarian discovery, and they have been living in a box, rather unloved, well, not unloved, they're looked after, but nobody takes them out and displays them, in the Society of Antiquaries for a very, very long time indeed. And I think that these are the last remnants of our earliest discovery of a late Roman copper alloy vessel hoard in Britain. So here, this is the drawings, again with wear visible on the lugs, these triangular lugs, suggesting that all three of these objects had been used. You can see it a bit better here. So what are Westland cauldrons? So they're named after the Westland region in Scandinavia, where quite a lot of these have come out of migration period graves. Halkyn, back in 2005, did a big catalogue of Westland cauldrons in Western Scandinavia, in Norway, basically. And these are objects far better known, actually, in Scandinavia and in down through the Low Countries into northern Gaul. There is a typological development. We can talk about how and why that typological development exists. Most of the Western cauldrons we seem to have in Britain fall into the 2C, 2D category. The 2C category is dated from 300 to 500. So it's a really interesting object. It's an object that crosses the traditional end of Roman Britain. The first one I ever encountered, I talked to the RFG about in London an eternity ago. When was that? Before the pandemic? Must have been. Can't remember. But I did years and years ago talk to the RFG about the Draper's Gardens hoard, found in 2007. Here it is. And this is the first Westland cauldron I ever encountered. This is a remarkably well-dated hoard archaeologically. It's been excavated by archaeologists, which is always a help, in a well constructed no earlier than 335, probably as late as 350, and deposited at some time after 375. There's quite a lot of things in it, including this rather nice Westland cauldron and a trivet, which you see here. That's an association you see in the Low Countries sometimes. And it has been suggested that these cauldrons sat on these sorts of trivets. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. There are some burials with these as funerary goods. Where are these things manufactured? It's a really good question. There's a tremendous Scandinavian literature looking at lead isotopes. So I think it was the Carlsberg Foundation paid for some scientists in Finland, possibly, or Sweden, to try and determine whether these were locally made or whether they had come from ores in the Mars Valley area. And probably these cauldrons, on the basis of that scientific evidence, are made from, or at least contain, lead from the Mars Valley. So they're exported from the late Roman Empire and the early medieval, and through into the early medieval period, into Scandinavia. No work has been done in Britain. No analytical work has been done on the British example, so that's a bit of a problem for us. So you can see here the European distribution. There are rather more dots in Britain, actually, in this map than there ought to be, because Halkyn is classing some things here that shouldn't really be in this corpus. But you can see the distribution through the Low Countries up into Denmark, in lowland England, and then because she's focusing on Norway, the Norwegian dots aren't on the map on the left, they're on the map on the right. So you can see how many there are. And you can. So it's an interesting distribution. The British examples have been studied largely in isolation as individual finds, and the British historiography about these objects doesn't really connect with the scholarship in continental Europe on them, which is quite interesting. Something I've been trying to join up a bit with some of those scholars over recent years. So, as an example, here we have the Halkyn mountain hoard, and on the right we have a hoard from Brittany, and you can see it contains Westland cauldrons. It contains a carinated bowl, just the same little flat dish thing, just like this. Looks very, very similar, actually. This has got a 5th, 6th century radiocarbon date associated with it. So again, suggesting that this might actually be very late Roman or earliest early medieval. When we find these in Britain, there are a small number of oddities. So Halkyn Mountain I would class as an oddity. Draper's Gardens I would class as an oddity. I'll talk to you about another oddity. But quite a few of the finds we have in Britain do come from early medieval graves. So this is the so-called warrior grave from Sawston I was talking about earlier. You can see the Westland cauldron top here, much like the ones I've just shown you. A pearl round becken, a pearl-edged bowl here, and shield boss, pommel top, and a sword. I think Howard might put me right on this. I don't know. I think this is probably. I think I looked up the shield boss. I think this grave is probably 6th rather than 5th. So, yeah. So most of them come from these sorts of contexts. Matt Bunker and Gabor Thomas excavated this early medieval burial in the Middle Thames. Again, a high-status male with a sword, a knife, tweezers, buckles, all the rest of it. And at his feet, we have a cauldron and a gadrooned bowl. Matt Bunker had these reproduced by a metalsmith in India, and you can see them looking very shiny on the left. So, yeah. And then just to talk about another oddity. So I said these hoards were unloved. So this is one of the vessels from Grassington in Yorkshire. Now these were found by metal detector in 1975 and reported to the Portable Antiquities Scheme in the early 21st century. So they had been in private collection for 25 years before they came to scientific notice. They are no longer, as far as I can determine, available for scientific study. They were looked at by the PAS at the time, and some photos were taken. And I must confess, for reasons that slightly puzzle me, these were recorded on the PAS as being Anglo-Scandinavian and 9th and 10th century. This is, I haven't put all of the vessels from Grassington on here, but this is clearly a late Roman, early medieval copper alloy vessel hoard. It's got an Irchester bowl, and it's got this Westland cauldron, which is a really splendid thing, right? It's actually intact. It's difficult to see in this picture, but it's an intact vessel. It breaks my heart to think that this is not in a museum, actually. I did sound a little bit like Indiana Jones there, didn't I? These things really do belong in museums. We do not have very many of these objects. It would be really interesting to have this item. So these are what I would call the corpus of Westland cauldrons from Britain. So Halkyn Mountain stands out with 3 as a hoard. Draper's Garden's got 1. Grassington's a hoard with 1. So we would all see these as late Roman hoards, whatever that means. And then we've got some examples in our early medieval graves. So these are quite rare objects. I would really like to understand more about their chronology and their science. I'd like to know if they are the same as the ones that have been sampled in continental Europe. Is the metal, are the lead isotopes the same? I haven't managed to do that yet. And as find specialists, I'd encourage you to keep an eye out for the diagnostic bits of these objects. So the triangular lugs are very obvious. If you find one, you now know what it is. You would probably figure it out anyway. But and if any of you happen to work in Verulamium Museum or have worked in Verulamium Museum, there is a ghost of a reference in the 1970s to one of these triangular lugs coming from the Verulamium Theatre excavations. I've talked to the museum and they say they don't know what I'm talking about. That's okay. But if any of you happen to know, it's just one of those loose ends I'd like to tie off, really. If anybody does know the Verulamium collection, we're a long way from St Albans here, but just on the off chance, I'd be really, really interested. Okay, and well, if you want to learn more, why would you? Perhaps you're interested. You could read about the full story with footnotes in the Antiquaries Journal for 2024, volume 104. Draper's Gardens Hoard's been published a long time. Grassington is coming out in YAJ, and this doesn't have any Westland Cauldrons in it, but is an interesting story of how you can rehabilitate an antiquarian find that has sat in a museum for a long time. And yeah, maybe some of you have read it already, I don't know, but all of those things might be of interest. So, Halkyn Mountain, it's an amazing group of objects. It's local. We should do a lot more with it. We should talk about it, right? We should, we're in the Grosvenor Museum in Chester. Maybe we could talk to the Society of Antiquaries and borrow them and put them on display here and talk about this. I don't know. I think it's a really interesting group of objects. And I think the 2 objects in London are interesting. I think it's a fairly compelling story. I'll see what you have to think now, I guess. I think we've got some time for questions, yeah? Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. That's excellent. Does anyone? We have time for a few questions. If anybody in the room's got any questions, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So I'm Antiquaries here. Just going to say on one hand, the flows were great. We're not experts, so on one hand, feel free to go through some of our data and submit error reports and say, actually, these are all part of Cauldrons. We really appreciate getting feedback from experts to update and improve some of our records. We see so much, it's a case of we can't do a perfect job with everything, unfortunately. And also, following on from what you're saying, be aware of the new definition of treasure. So if they were turning up now, actually we probably make a good case for them to actually treasure and enter the museum.
No, absolutely.
Can I just stop you there? Just for the film purposes, we have to repeat. So basically, it was a statement regarding that the PAS do not know everything. So if find specialists are actually finding this, to kind of come back to them and actually so they can update their records. And then the second question was about because of the changes in the Treasure Act, they would now be possibly considered treasure. I don't know if you'd like to.
Yeah, no, of course. I don't expect FLOs to know everything. And the first thing I did was submit that error report, right? And largely the reason I did that was because I had a colleague from continental Europe email me and say, why are these listed on the PAS as 9th, 10th century? And and that's one of the reasons I've written the note in the YAJ actually, is so that we've got, we've done that bit of work. That's science, isn't it? That's analysis. That's what the PAS is for, right? You record it, other people can use the data, and the new definition of treasure, absolutely. I think historically though, that has been a real problem, and I've been around a lot of provincial museums that have got really nice copper alloy vessel hoards that, if they had been silver, would all be in the British Museum in London. And that the different way we have treated those categories of material has had a real impact on how well known some of these finds are and how well studied they are. If you want to know about late Roman silver, the volumes are enormous, copious, very detailed. If you want to know about late Roman copper alloy vessels, it's much more of a struggle, I think. Yeah, thank you.
I would say that's not a bad thing, though, because now we can actually go back and do things.
Yeah.
We don't have to go through the British Museum in order
That's
to
true.
do it.
That is true.
So, any other questions in the room? Yeah.
Do you think that the ones that are in early graves, are they being brought over, preserved, brought over and then buried, or are they just something that's continued for a while? Because I've done that.
Yeah. Do you want to repeat the question? Yeah.
Okay, so this is a question about whether the cauldrons are heirlooms that perhaps have been imported into Britain in the early medieval period, or whether they're continued production in some way. That's a really good question. I think we have some real challenges. Are these vessels being used in late Roman Britain? So possibly they are. So they could be heirlooms from late Roman Britain. They could be objects circulating in the North Sea world in the 5th and 6th centuries. That's possible. They could be being manufactured in the 5th and 6th centuries. I'm sure they are being manufactured actually in the 5th and 6th centuries. How we write those biographies from the objects, I think, is really difficult in the absence of production evidence, really high quality scientific analysis. Yeah, I guess you choose the story you want to write, or maybe you have different stories, right? That's probably a better way. Is to write this a bit like the end of The French Lieutenant's Woman and have different endings. Yeah.
No?
I was just struck by the fact that both in the halls and in some of the graves, you've got multiple vessels, which surely tells you something about their curation as an assemblage, do you think?
So some of these assemblages have multiple vessels, and does that tell us anything about the curation of those objects and I suppose their social significance? This is again an interesting question. So, what are these cauldrons being used for? That's a good question. If you look at you can't do this uncritically, but if you look at early medieval myth, cauldrons are all about magic, right? If you look at the Sutton Hoo ship burial, there is a massive cauldron chain in that burial, which must have hung from the rafters of a great hall. And we have some lovely cauldron chains that must have hung from equally grand rafters from late Roman Britain. Now, these cauldrons are probably too small to have been suspended from those chains. There are bigger cauldrons in the early medieval world. So do they have some special significance? Or are they utilitarian? Is it the kind of thing you can carry around with you and boil your stew in when you need to eat it? I don't know, but these are questions we need to ask. It's a small collection of objects, isn't it? How did they actually function in society? When we see them in graves. I've got none actually in Britain. There are none from occupation deposits.
It's very interesting.
Right, I think we'll leave it there. Thank
Thank
you.
you.